Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, this is Oxhorn, and I've got a question for you. Are synths people? By people, I don't mean having been born from a woman conceived by the union between a man and a woman, because obviously they are not that. By people, I mean a broader interpretation of the word. When San Francisco hippies say, pets are people too, they obviously don't mean that pets are human beings. They're talking about the personalities of a pet, the character of a pet. Now, I don't think pets are people. I'm just using that as an example of how I'm talking about the word person. When I ask if synths are people too, I'm asking if synths can carry all of the same characteristics of a human being. Personality, morals, character, wants, wishes, desires, free will, everything that makes up a person. Are synths people too? And the reason I'm asking this is because I've noticed a lot of people on some of my videos, especially those of you who side with the Brotherhood of Steel, ad Victoriam. They'll often say things like, who cares if he or she is a synth? They're just robots. Would you waste your time on robots? Synths are just machines, and so on and so forth. Now, in the real world, this real world that we live in, I do not believe that mankind will ever get to the point where we can create people. I don't think, personally, that artificial intelligence will ever advance to the point where it is on par with human intelligence. Artificial intelligence simply grows in complexity and power as humans add to it. And sure, there could be a future where artificial intelligence is incredibly informative and powerful and can do a lot of processing, but there is so much that humans can do that machines could never do, like feel, think independently, think creatively. Robots and AI programs that do any of those things today have been programmed specifically to do those things. They don't do them because they want to do them. And that's the thing. Robots don't want. Robots simply do. The synths in Fallout 4, however, are completely different. The synths in Fallout 4 have their own wants, have their own free will, and learn by experience. Again, I don't think we'll ever get to the point where we create artificial beings that have all of those characteristics. But Fallout 4 is a fantasy, and in the world of this fantasy, we have to accept what the world makers give us. And the world makers are giving us a reality where manufactured synths have the free will of human beings. But it's clear from Fallout 4 that synths are not just machines. They're certainly not robots. All you have to do is look at how a synth is made. When you go to the Institute, you get a front row seat to the manufacturing of synths. It's a straight up flashback to the Fifth Element. First, they build the synth's nervous system and blood vessels. Then they assemble a skeleton with real bone, piece by piece. Then they grow muscle and other organs. Then they fill it all with blood. And finally bombard the body with ultraviolet light to cause skin to grow. Then they dunk the body in some vat of red supergoo, which somehow endows them with life, more or less. And they walk off to do their synth thing. Their base components are not gears and gizmos. They're not made out of cogs and wheels, cathode ray tubes, or Nixie lights. They're made out of human flesh and blood. And we know this due to the entire premise of the game. Why was Sean taken from Vault 111 to begin with? Why did Kellogg and his goons even enter the vault? Why did they need Sean? When we get to the Institute, we learn from Father that the Institute needed Sean because they needed a sample of human DNA that had not been corrupted by the nuclear detonation. They used Sean's DNA as the foundation for their recipe for synths.
I was the perfect candidate, an infant with uncorrupted DNA.
In fact, that's why you, the sole survivor, were kept in cryostasis. That's why Kellogg referred to you as the backup.
But if something were to go wrong, if I died, well, the Institute realized a contingency plan was prudent. Another source of pre-war DNA, preferably related to their primary subject. It only made sense that my parents should fill that role. So you were kept alive and safe within the vault.
If anything happened to Sean, they would go to you and harvest your DNA for use in manufacturing synths. This means that you, the sole survivor, are directly related not only to Sean, but to every living, breathing, walking synth on the planet.
Just as you gave life to Father, he gave life to many of us.
Which, incidentally, has some rather creepy implications when you consider that you have the ability to romance both Curie and Dance. Yuck. In fact, the only physical difference between a synth and a human being is that a synth has a synth component in the middle of their heads. But Kellogg had a synth component in his head too, and Kellogg was fully human. If you read the terminals in the Institute, they often refer to Kellogg as like a cyborg or something like that, kind of between human and machine. It's not really a synth, but he's not really human anymore either. His life has been artificially extended, and maybe this synth component has something to do with it. But when you meet Kellogg, he has all of the same goals, memories, and ambitions as he always has had. I think it would be a stretch to say that just because Kellogg has a synth component in his head, that he's suddenly no longer human, that he has become fully machine. And that begs the question, at what point in your physical modification do you transform from human to machine? Is it with a prosthetic arm or leg? Is it when you wear a wig? Or is the synth component really the heart and soul of a synth? Can we say that the human soul takes up the physical space that the synth component replaces? Or is it possible for someone to be both human and synth at the same time? So you might ask, well, how do you know that synth genetic material is grown in a lab? How do you know that it's real human muscle and skin and tissue that's been grown, instead of just maybe some synthetic blood or synthetic muscle or synthetic nervous system? Well, we know this due to Dr. Rosalind Chambers. If you do the Covenant questline, you find an underground bunker with a mad scientist who is doing evil experiments on both people and synths. She's trying to find a way to reliably detect whether a human is a synth or not. She flat out says that there's absolutely no way to genetically or physically tell the difference between a synth and a human being.
A living synth is indistinguishable from a human by any medical test yet devised.
This means that there's no blood test you could run. There's no examination of muscle or skin. You can't monitor brainwave activity. There's no voice recognition you could do, or a retina scan you could do. You can't test by thumbprints, or even by testing DNA. Manufactured synths are physically identical to human beings, according to the lore of this world. Now, Rosalind Chambers does say that it might be possible to detect a human from a synth psychologically. That maybe there's some way the synth mind works that is fundamentally different from a human mind. I think Dr. Rosalind Chambers is getting close to the issue when she talks about synth behavior being the best way to determine the difference between a human and a synth. Now, there are two physical ways to tell the difference between a human and a synth. The first is something that you learn when you visit the Institute. Some of the scientists offhandedly remark to each other that no matter how much candy a synth eats, it never gains weight. So, apparently, synths are immune to obesity. I don't understand how, but according to lore, that's the reality. And the second is that they never age. I remember reading a terminal or hearing a holotape while I was exploring the Institute of a scientist who objected to Father's creation of a child version of himself in synth form because the synth would never age. The child would always be a child. The very idea of making children synths didn't make any sense to this scientist because the child would be a child forever. So synths can't grow or age. That's one definite difference. This also brings up some strange questions, like, if a synth never ages, why would the Institute replace humans with synths? Because surely it's only a matter of time before people start to figure out that the replacement is a synth, because the replacement never ages. How long could Mayor McDonough be mayor of Diamond City? How long could Roger Warwick fool his very family into thinking that he's not a synth? When his son grows to be 40 years old and looks exactly like his father, don't you think that's gonna kind of give it away? I think they'll figure it out by then. Or did the Institute have some sort of contingency plan where they would eliminate the synth before those questions were raised? I don't know. In the short term, it may be better to take a look at personality, to take a look at the psychological. I did an entire video on how to tell whether or not your settler is a synth, and I proved that there's no way to do it outside of mods. You can't look at the settler's resistances to tell whether or not the settler is a synth. The settler does not have more energy resistance. I showed that using the awareness perk. That's actually a myth. But many players have observed synth settlers snap and suddenly start attacking other settlers. I haven't experienced that myself, but I've seen many videos online of that happening. And I believe that happens based on your progression in the main storyline. I believe that if you make an enemy of the Institute before finishing the game and destroying the Institute, that the synths in your settlements get quote-unquote activated by the Institute and go on a rampage. Which raises a whole bunch of other questions, because some of the lore of the game says that many of these very same synths don't know that they're synths because their minds have been wiped by the railroad, and yet could the Institute activate those synths? Or maybe those settler synths are not mind-wiped railroad synths. Maybe those are actually planted by the Institute. Who knows? The best way to go about taking a look at the differences in personality and psychology between synths and humans is to observe the synths in the Institute talking amongst each other. They talk about how thankful and grateful they are to Father in the Institute for creating them. They speak of Father almost as a god. And they talk about you as the mother of Sean in almost reverential terms.
I can't express how truly humbling it is to stand in your presence. Father is more than just our leader. He is our creator.
That doesn't sound like something a machine would do. It also seems odd that the Institute would program the synth to act that way. What benefit would the Institute get from these synths being grateful for being made? You could argue that they get loyalty, but they actually don't. You can overhear a conversation between synths talking about one of their fellow synths being missing.
Have you seen J522 around? He didn't show up for duty today, and I can't seem to find him.
Did you check robotics? He was probably scheduled for routine maintenance. I wouldn't worry about it.
I thought so too, but he wasn't in the log, and everyone I've asked hasn't seen him. He's never just missed his shift like that.
What are you saying?
I'm worried something might have happened to him. No one knows where he is. It's like he just disappeared. It doesn't feel right.
Shh. Keep your voice down. You know what happens if they hear you talking like this? They'll wipe you. I suggest you keep this to yourself. I don't want to hear any more. Do whatever you want. Just leave me out of it.
There are two things interesting about this exchange. The female synth is talking about the missing synth almost in terms of how she escaped. Like she did some crazy and noble thing, like, wow, look at this synth. She managed to escape and get away. What she's revealing with that line of talk is how she feels about being in the Institute. She wishes she weren't. The male synth in this exchange picked up on that vibe by being immediately uncomfortable with the way the conversation was going. He didn't want to be a part of it. He knew that this kind of talk was dangerous. And why was it dangerous? Because if the Institute found out they were talking that way, they were at risk of being deactivated, having their minds wiped, being reset. What he's exhibiting is fear. He's exhibiting the very human fight or flight mentality. He's exhibiting a very human desire for self-preservation. Again, a very odd thing for a machine to do. What I notice is that synths, with few exceptions, exhibit all of the same characteristics as humans. They want to live, they're thankful for life, they're afraid of death, they have opinions, they have taste. They have emotions, they have feelings. They have reason and can deduce things for themselves. The reason for this is because the Institute made a critical step in their creation of synths. Right around the time Nick Valentine and Dima escaped from the Institute was creating synths that could learn from experience. Nick Valentine had an entire personality put into his brain. The personality of a cop from the 21st century. Dima, however, didn't. He was allowed to cobble together a personality based on the experiences that he had throughout his life, and all synths after him were the same.
We were prototypes, Nick. The first synths capable of independent thinking and judgment.
Keep talking.
One of the Institute's experiments had to do with how our brains could process personality. If we could handle individualized feelings and behaviors, I was allowed to develop mine based on experience. But with you, they wanted to try transferring an entire personality into you. I couldn't let them do it to you anymore. You were my brother, Nick. I helped you escape the Institute. We left together.
If I were your brother, I'd remember.
The Institute approaches synths as machines. If they make choices that the Institute doesn't like, they're malfunctioning. What's interesting is that one scientist mentions that Generation 3 synths malfunction at a greater rate than previous versions.
Like any machine, a synth can malfunction. Just wish it didn't happen so often.
If you ask me, the synth software could use a little more debugging.
Generation 1 and Generation 2 synths were not made from human DNA. They didn't have any human genetic material in them. They were purely synthetic. Everything within them was synthetic. They also talk with robot voices, make robot decisions, talk about the Institute in robot terms.
Please alert the Facilities Division immediately. Scanning. Subject identified.
They are clearly not human. They are robots. What I don't get is how robots like Codsworth and Curie can have human personalities and human minds, having been built generations before synths were ever built. So human to the point that you can take Curie's mind out of her Mrs. Handy body and put it in a synth and basically have a human walking around. Curie, the synth, is indistinguishable from any other human, aside from having a sort of naive look at the world. This means that humanity had the ability to create minds that were on par with human minds long before the Institute. It means that the Institute made a strategic choice to make the Gen 1 and Gen 2 synths less human, to not have human minds, to have very robotic minds that could be ordered and given instructions. That's the mentality that they went into the Generation 3 synths with. But what they're finding with the Gen 3 synths is that those synths are not obeying. They're malfunctioning more often than the other synths, and they don't really understand why. They malfunction in a variety of ways. Some of them straight up leave the Institute and escape, and others satisfy their own personal curiosity, like looking into a terminal just to see what's there.
Dr. Ao saw you accessing a terminal. You know you are not permitted to access terminals in that section. Is Dr. Ao mistaken?
Yes. I mean, no, he's not. But I was cleaning the terminal, and it switched on by mistake. I was just shutting it down.
Was that a stutter? Have you developed a defect, Unit? Maybe you need to be reset.
Sir, I assure you that won't be necessary. It won't happen again.
See that it doesn't.
I think what the Institute fails to grasp is that with their Generation 3 synths, they failed to include a programmable robotic mind. Instead, they did what pre-war humanity did and gave the synths essentially human minds, minds that can learn based on experience. They don't get that by doing so they've basically created life. They still think of Gen 3 synths in Gen 1 and 2 terms, as machines meant to serve the Institute. But what we see is a group of creatures that are not just machines. They're clearly not just machines. They not only have human DNA, but they've got free will. Yes, they have synth components, but they can disobey orders. They can make their own decisions and they have their own ambitions. For all of these reasons, in my personal opinion, the synths of this post-apocalyptic fantasy world are people. And in that regard, the Railroad is right. They shouldn't be treated like slaves. They should be treated like real people. They should be valued for the lives that they are. Again, I would never have this opinion in the real world. I'm only saying this from a role-playing perspective. From a role-playing perspective in this game, I think it's clear that the synths are people. Now, I can empathize with the Brotherhood of Steel. They are scarred and terrified after the nuclear war, and so they distrust technology. And maybe that's even right. Maybe certain technologies, like the knowledge of splitting the atom or the knowledge of creating nuclear bombs, are so terrifying that humanity should just not have that power. Maybe that's right, and maybe the Brotherhood of Steel is right to hunt down all pre-war technology, to hoard it, and to keep it from being used by others. The mistake that I think the Brotherhood of Steel makes is that they regard all synths as technology instead of people. And in so doing, they make the same mistake that the Institute makes. The Institute still sees Gen 3 synths as machines, as property. Property that belongs to the Institute and should be used by the Institute. Anyone who uses it outside of the way the Institute chooses to use it is stealing from them. They see the synths as property. The Brotherhood of Steel sees synths as an abomination, and they use that word over and over and over again to the point where it becomes really trying to hear Dance say abomination one more time, or to walk through the Pridwin and hear one more squire say abomination whenever Nick Valentine walks by.
That thing should be scrapped for parts.
Trust me, friend. Neither me nor the machine wins out in that transaction.
The Brotherhood of Steel so fanatically follow their doctrine about technology that they can't see beyond the fact that Gen 3 synths are manufactured to the reality that Gen 3 synths have souls, for lack of a better term. What is a human soul? Well, whatever it is, I think in this fantasy world that Gen 3 synths have them. Now, where I will disagree with the Railroad is on how they approach the preservation of synths, because they do so in purely physical terms. They wipe the minds of synths to make it harder for the Institute to find them, and to preserve the actual synthetic bodies of the synths. The soul of that synth is gone forever. When they wipe the minds of a synth, they're wiping that synth's personality. They're wiping the sum total of that synth's learned experiences. The person who chose to leave the Institute because he or she wanted a different life is now gone forever. And in his or her place is this new infant that awakens from the mind-wiping chair, not knowing where he or she is, not knowing what he or she is. So in a way, the Railroad is actually destroying synths. They're preserving the bodies, sure, but they're destroying the people. In that regard, I agree with Dima, which makes it even more horrifying at what he did to 2 synths that we know of. 3 if you count Victoria. But that is just my humble opinion, ladies and gentlemen, and I would love to hear yours. What do you think? Are synths people? This topic came to mind after I finished my big Far Harbor lore video, and while I'm on work about an Institute video, which is going to be a whole lot of fun, and after reading all of your comments really do inspire me to create new content, so continue leaving your comments. I read every single one of them, and I respond to the best ones. If you like this video, please subscribe for more Fallout 4 content, and if you like what I do and you want to support me personally, consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon. But more than anything, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just glad you're here and watching my videos. Thanks again, and I'll see you tomorrow with another video.